United. Anyway, it is a great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Frank Hanbidge. Frank and I both spent the majority of our careers at Habs, and together we clocked up 67 years. Interestingly, we differ in the sense that he is what is known as a termite, and I am not. And I think I can see another termite crawling around here as well. But I just thought it might interest you to hear from Frank what a termite actually is and why I don't qualify.
I believe that a termite is a form of insect life which infests woodwork and is very reluctant to leave. And that's probably a pretty accurate description of the termites, which is an organisation of staff and former staff at Haberdashers who have taught a minimum of 100 terms, for 33 years in a term. And there are some here. And indeed our sort of informal chairman, Keith Cheney, I don't know when our next meeting is. We meet only when there is a new member.
Should be March.
March. And who will that be?
The groundsman called Croker.
Right. Good. Well, I look forward to that.
Okay, so you see they have very strict rules, so the mere 94 terms that I clocked up don't qualify me, and I think the fact that I did my first 18 terms at Merchant Taylors' School meant that I certainly was ruled out at a very early stage. Anyway, it was only really when Frank and I worked together in the last few years that we got to know each other really well. We were involved in a lot of interviews together, but not with each other. We tended to be interviewing rather nervous-looking boys who were sitting in front of us in my office. But of course, Frank was a member of the English department, I was in modern languages, and we did have previous contact. Used to meet up for lunch, of course, but also when Frank produced and directed The Winslow Boy. I can't remember what year that was, but I stage managed that.
84.
84, and by a very happy coincidence, Toby Mitchell is here, who actually played the role of Ronnie Winslow. He, you will remember, is the one who is accused of stealing a 5-shilling postal order. So if you happen to have a 5-shilling postal order on you, do watch out. We never did work out whether he was guilty or not. What do you think, Toby? Do you think you did or you didn't?
I didn't.
You didn't, okay. But a good example of how education can lead into great things, because Toby now earns his living as a producer and director and actor. So there we are. I don't know the extent to which playing Ronnie Winslow led to that, but there was certainly an interest there which was nurtured. When, of course, Frank became head of sixth form, and shortly after this I became senior master in 1997, we were, amongst other things, responsible for pastoral care, discipline, and the general running of the school. And this, of course, haberdashers being haberdashers, brought us into almost daily contact, trying to sort out one problem or another. Anyway, Frank has very kindly agreed to be interviewed, and I think I'll start with a question which might surprise some of you. You always seem to be the most English of English teachers, but am I right in thinking that that Frank Hanbidge is not your real name?
That is in fact the case. I have actually brought with me a copy of, well, it's not a copy of the original of my birth certificate, which I'll hand over to John, and he can find my baptismal name there, where my finger is, John. You can find it there.
Ah, yes. So we are not indeed talking to Frank. We're actually talking to Enrique Francisco.
Enrique Francisco, that's right. I don't know why it was sort of curiously inverted for that document, because I've always believed my name to be Frank Henry, but my Argentine birth certificate gives it as the other way around, Enrique Francisco. We in South America do not believe that we pronounce the word C starting with our tongue between our teeth. So I was known as a child as Cisco, not Cisco, as they would say in Iberia. But that was where I began, yes.
And I mean, with such an unusual background, brought up in Argentina, where do you feel you belong?
That's a very interesting and good question. I don't think that I am an Argentine. I have lost my Spanish, but my father was an Irishman. I have a very small claim, actually, on any form of English nationality. My father was an Irishman, though he claimed British nationality, I think more on grounds of religion than geography. He was born in Southern Ireland, but before partition. But the fact that he was a Protestant made him feel he was an Englishman, I suppose. And I suppose I have felt that I am Irish. I've never been to Ireland, and I suppose it's too late now. But it seems one of those sort of unattainable but tremendous refuges which I'm interested in. I read a lot about Ireland, but it's a bit like Warren Lewis, C.S. Lewis's brother, who was a world authority on Versailles and wrote 5 books about it, but he would never go there on the grounds that actually to see the place would spoil it somehow. And I think that's how I rather feel about Ireland.
So when did your parents go out to Argentina?
My father was an engineer and worked with the GEC overseas division, and he worked for a long time in Africa in the early and middle 30s, and then married toward the end of the 30s, and my parents went to Argentina then.
So that was late 30s, was it?
Yes.
I mean, just before war broke out in Europe, so
Yes.
they in effect missed the war.
They did. It was something that I think troubled both my parents, that their families and so on were exposed to war. My grandfather's, my paternal grandfather, had moved with his wife to England from Ireland in the 30s. There was very little commercial prospects in Ireland at that time. And my father volunteered at the British Embassy to fight in the Second World War, and was offered a commission in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, and was due to sail to India for training. It was considered dangerous to cross the North Atlantic, so it was not envisaged that he should come home. But almost the first thing that happened in the Second World War, before 1939 was out, was the great Battle of the River Plate. That changed minds at the War Office, and he received a telegram instructing him to stay in post because the South Atlantic might become a major theatre of war. There was a man, a Briton in the professional life of Argentina, and it was thought it would be helpful for him to stay. So there we stayed in the lap of luxury throughout the war years.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you then came back to England at some point, which means, of course, your own education was quite a mixed experience. Can you tell us something about your own school days and possibly how your education differed from that which a boy at Habs would receive?
Yes. My very first school was in Argentina, but I don't think we did much more than make raffia mats. I have some fetching pictures of me in little smocks that children in Latin countries wear when they go to school. I certainly don't remember learning to read and write there. I do remember actually not being able to read, because I do have a vivid recollection of being hugely ashamed and embarrassed, because I was going with my parents on a train to a resort called Bahia Blanca to the south of Buenos Aires, and it was in a crowded compartment, but I saw a copy of La Prensa on the floor, which I picked up and looked at, knowing that this is what adults did. They looked at sheets of paper for no apparent reason for long periods of time. And the Argentine gentleman beside me, to the enormous hilarity of the carriage, inverted the newspaper through 180 degrees, and it was my first realization that actually print had two ways around. It could only be decoded one way. But yeah, my educational history thereafter was quite complicated, not as complicated as my domestic situation, and in my first 25 years I lived in 22 different places. I have a nephew of 25 who's only ever lived in one house, and it seems to me probably that my stasis in later life derives from the fact that the first part of my life was extremely restless.
Anyway, you then went on to read English at Oxford. I mean, clearly there must have been many things and many people who influenced you during that time, and many things you enjoyed and things which you did not like so much at Oxford. Can you talk a bit about your experiences at Oxford?
Yes. I suppose, like quite a lot of people, certainly lots of haberdashers who come back and talk to me after they've gone to university, I did have a slight sense of disappointment. I think that's probably because the excitements of being in the sixth form at school seemed to coincide perfectly with some sort of stage of development of the human mind. So it all seems terribly exciting and fresh and original and new. And when you go to university, you become rather cynical, and I think you just respond in a less excited way to things that are being presented to you. Also, and perhaps this is particularly true of Oxford, a lot of what we did was tremendously dry and technical and, quite frankly, dull. English had which it's still called the School of English Language and Literature, and my goodness, there was a lot of language. We spent a lot of time doing things like translating English sentences into Anglo-Saxon, a useful skill if ever there was one. I think I like the people. I like the Dons because they were also strange. Seriously strange and interesting people. As long as you would keep them away from their subject, it was all right.
You told me once about an Australian
yes.
Don who taught you.
Yes, he's died within this last year. In his early 90s, Bruce Mitchell was the world's leading authority on Anglo-Saxon syntax. But he also claimed to be the only Oxford Don who'd ever been a railway porter. But he was a really bluff, confident, outgoing Australian. He was given to rather disconcerting greetings. When you came into a class, he would say, "Come in, Frank, cast a gloom over the proceedings." We all loved Bruce very much, but his enthusiasm for Anglo-Saxon was not always communicated.
And so how did it happen that you decided to become a teacher, and perhaps more of interest to us that you ended up at Habs?
There were 4 people from my English A-level set who went to Oxford through English, though one of them did theology, but all of them ended up in education in one way or another. And I think we just forget what a huge proportion of Oxford and Cambridge graduates in those days did. I mean, it was something like 30% in the university as a whole went into education, and in the art subject it was much higher than that. So it seemed very much the sort of thing to do. How I ended up at Habs was my first application for a job was to Manchester Grammar School. I didn't get that job, but the job left a vacancy at Roundhay Grammar School for Boys in Leeds, whence the individual went to take up the job at Manchester. And I applied for that job at the same time as Habs, and I thought Habs looked the better bet. But I was offered the job at Roundhay, but I turned it down because I wanted Habs, and luckily I was lucky enough to get it.
And careers tend to divide up into different sections, even if you stay at the same school. I mean, mine certainly did, and I'm sure yours did as well. Were there periods during your career at Habs where you have particularly fond memories, individuals who made a particularly strong impression on you?
Well, I suppose in my early years I think of the department very much, the English department, which then had 7 members, 4 Cambridge graduates and 2 Oxford graduates, and another person who did not teach the 6th form. But it was a very remarkable place, really, in that there were 3 published writers in the department. One of the oddities about being young is that you just accept as normal what you are presented with, and it did not strike me as remarkable in any way that there should be 3 published writers in the department. But they were interesting characters. I suppose the most striking and memorable was Simon Stewart, who must have taught quite a lot of people here, I suppose. The son and brother of an earl, the son of a millionairess, Sarah Guggenheim, a pretty well-known name, and that he should have, and a sort of 5-star intellectual to boot, and an extremely striking and good-looking man as well. If ever the gods poured a fortune on one individual, it was upon him. But he's somebody that I remember very clearly and fondly. But as a school as a whole, Haberdasher was a very different place then. Many of you will remember it. There was still quite a lot of beating going on, and where we were under in our little office, just 2 desks in it for the 7 of us, we were beneath Di Barling's room, later the head of 6th form's room, and from time to time the very distinctive sound of a child being beaten would echo through the room and bring about silence. Had a wonderful effect in the classroom when it was happening above, and dead silence, and everybody was counting with a sort of extraordinary intensity, and then there would be a visible relaxing of shoulders when the 3rd, 4th or 5th, or I never heard 6th stroke was followed by silence, and a sort of universal sigh of relief. Later,
Were there other periods? I mean, that's
there were
typical that sounds. The school did move on.
There were other periods. I remember fondly my many years of association with the careers department, which was perhaps not very well named because mainly it dealt with university application and administration, and that brought me a lot into contact with the school office and its administration, and there were a succession of very remarkable people there, very capable women. I think of Joyce Franklin with fondness, with Gwendon Aubrey, Mary Black, people like that. It was not always the happiest of places, I don't think, from the point of view of the interrelationship of the characters there, but it was certainly interesting to see this sort of broader perspective on the school. A school staff room, the common room, is a very partial view of what a school does and is about, and it was interesting to have that external side.
But I can't let you get away without mentioning Michael Fitch and Perry Keenlyside, who were very close colleagues, or
Yes, thank you.
over a number of years.
Thank you for that. Yes, Michael Fitch was the head of department, of course, up till the early 90s. Sui generis, I don't think I've ever met anybody quite like Michael. Certainly precise, a good mind, exacting, a good teacher. I think he certainly, his pupils always talked about him very fondly, but I did not warm to him on a personal level very strongly myself. Perry,
sorry, is it true, by the way, that you may know this, that Michael, there was a rumour that Michael used to have a bottle of gin and tonic in his pocket?
It wasn't gin and tonic, it was gin and Dubonnet. But he had a bag of great antiquity, a leather bag, but which he claimed to carry his exercise books in, and indeed the top covering was the top layer was exercise books, but when he put it down, and it was a heavy bag, there would be a very characteristic clink, which couldn't be disguised. But he was not intoxicated on school premises, but he did enjoy a drink, certainly.
Yes. What a loyal answer. And Perry, I mean, we all have very fond memories of Perry Keenlyside.
Yes, Perry, and how sad he's not with us still. He should be. He's younger than me. But yes, I suppose Perry had a bit of style and sort of polish, and he was musical, theatrical, artistic, and yet very strongly with his feet on the floor. I think he was probably popular in every part of the school, both its staff and among the student body.
And anyway, we probably should talk about the boys. Is there, in your view, such a thing as a typical Haberdasher's boy? I mean, how might you characterise a Habs boy?
Well, I don't think Habs is a school for shrinking violets. It's a tough school, but tough in a quite different way from the toughness I think of my own education. It's intellectually demanding, and I think probably pretty competitive among the boys themselves. I think that Haberdashers owed a tremendous amount to its Jewish contingent, and I think that's probably less marked today, a little bit less marked today than it was when I went. But the qualities that I think of as quintessentially Jewish: combativeness, humour, argumentativeness, perhaps above all. I once heard somebody say, where there are two Jews, you will find three opinions. And I think that's extremely true, and to the great benefit of education. The other thing, though, that went with this confidence, it's chutzpah, I suppose, there was a respect for teachers. I think that in Jewish culture, the rabbi, which does mean literally teacher, I believe, is a respected figure, though certainly not one that you can't argue with, and that was certainly true. So I would say that combativeness and joie de vivre probably are the most striking characteristics of the Haberdasher.
There's interesting. For 10 years, along with Dr. Alvarez, I ran Jewish Assembly. And I think it was both one of the most enjoyable and challenging parts of my job at Haberdashers to ensure that we didn't make the front page of the Jewish Chronicle. plenty of opportunities for that. Very exciting, very, as I say, very challenging. But you're talking about what the pupils bring to haberdashers. What do you think a Habs boy learns during the course of his education, which is of particular value to him? I mean, you've mentioned how useful Anglo-Saxon has been to you. What is it that Habs can actually teach boys, which then become sort of essential skills, life skills?
Well, I think they probably do learn quite a lot from one another. I've always been extremely sceptical whether education, lessons, classrooms actually contribute very much to what people learn. And I know it's a heresy to say so, but I often think that if we didn't go to school, we probably wouldn't turn out much worse than we do at the moment. There should really be an enormous national experiment to, let's say, withhold everybody whose name starts with the letter B from school and just see after 20 or 30 years whether they've done any worse than the rest of us. I rather doubt if they would. But they do. They don't. What they don't learn, I suppose, they don't learn how to be punctual. They don't learn how to be hard-working. They teach themselves that in some cases. They don't learn manners. What do we give them? I suppose we give them one another the opportunity of friendship, which is perhaps the most important thing that school can give, of which there are many examples here of long-standing, lifelong friendships which have been facilitated by Haberdasher School.
Yes, I think one of the things Haberdashers does give are opportunities. I mean, education is about opportunities, and the majority of haberdashers are sufficiently motivated to seize these opportunities. And I'm always deeply impressed by the ability of haberdashers' boys, for example, to speak in public. And if you know the school well, you will know that there are an amazingly varied number of opportunities to actually speak in public. And when I was at my grammar school, unless you joined the sort of debating society, you had no chance to stand up in front of an audience and speak. At haberdashers, this happens on a daily basis, and I think that's an enormously important life skill, to be able to present yourself with confidence amongst a group of people. But anyway, you were head of sixth form for a number of years. I don't know quite how many years. Can you remind me?
Well, it was 10 years.
10 years as head of sixth form. Do you remember any incidents which were particularly noteworthy or amusing, outrageous, a combination of these things?
You and I both spent a lot of our time chasing miscreants in one form or another, and most misdoing is not terribly interesting, but occasionally there would be things which were funny which happened. I remember one case of a boy whom we will call Ben, who was struggling a bit with his work, and I had explicitly refused his request to attend Wimbledon. Then it was reported to me that by the games department that he had not come to games one day, but they had seen him at Wimbledon on the television monitor which they keep in the games department. And the foolish boy had actually stationed himself beside the scoreboard, so that at the end of every game, the camera would flash across to the scoreboard, and there he was. And so they recorded this. And then we set up a little scenario the following day where he was summoned to the room where the television was, and which is in the office, and I said, you weren't on your cricket activity yesterday. You didn't go to Wimbledon, did you? He said, no, sir. And then he continued denying for a few minutes, and then we had one of the junior members of the games department come in at that moment and say, hey, have you got that video of Sandpress yesterday afternoon? I just want to see that last set. So he switches on while we continue to cross-examine him. And there he was on the screen, and his protestations of innocence were of no further avail. So that was one amusing incident I can recall. But I suppose the most startling one was when we had a report from the Aldenham Country Park that a group of haberdashers' boys had kidnapped a fowl, a chicken, a cockerel, in fact, from the pens there of rare breed animals, and had stolen it in a cardboard box. And that story took a lot of unravelling, as you will remember, John. The idea, apparently, of these miscreants was that they should capture this bird and then release it at a party, which would be very funny, they thought. So they stole it away, and did they bring it over here? Their plan was certainly to leave it in this box on the cricket field until they could pick it up at the end of the day. They'd stolen it at lunchtime. And I said, well, didn't you think it was going to be rather conspicuous in its box? I said, well, we painted the box green, sir, so we thought nobody would be able to see it on the cricket pitch. But one of the things it showed me is that young people have no sort of foresight at all. Just like standing by the scoreboard at Wimbledon, what were they going to do with the bird afterwards? And the individual who was, I think, the chief perpetrator of this, he reminded me of his name, but I won't repeat it.
Yeah. He's become a barrister, by the way. So
I said, well, what were you going to do with it after the party? He said, well, I was going to put it in my garden shed. And we were going to keep it there. I said, didn't you think your parents might notice? They're very noisy birds, cockerels. He said, oh no, they never go in the garden. I said, not at all. No, never seen my dad in the garden. But he just generally hadn't thought about what might happen afterwards. It did turn out that this bird was extreme rarity, and there are only about 100 of them in the world, and there was almost 99. But I think you'll probably recall that incident well, John.
Yes, I first came across it when I was sitting in Lunchtime Live, which is a series of concerts which took place in that year on a Friday. I had for the last 10 or 11 years of my career as senior master, I was always in the firing line. If there was ever a problem, people would rush up to me and try and get me to sort it out. And so I looked for places to escape attention, and there were two ideal places. One was cricket umpiring. If you umpired a cricket match, nobody could come near you and present you with a problem. And the other was a lunchtime concert. And I remember sitting in this concert on a Friday lunchtime, and in comes this gentleman, and he was clutching this green box. And he sort of waved over to me. He'd obviously been sent by the office to find me, and I thought it would be I'd better leave as discreetly as I could. And he presented me, and it did actually have the bird in it. So they'd obviously abandoned the box in the country park and scarpered, and this chap had retrieved the bird and followed them into school. What I then had to do, of course, was try and investigate. But of course, the painting of the box was the real giveaway, because I thought, where would you paint a box in haberdasher? So I went straight up to the art department and said to the people there, "Have you seen anybody recently painting a box?" And immediately a couple of names came up, and it was indeed those boys who had perpetrated the whole incident. So yes, it was an interesting interview with the parents, wasn't it? I do remember that.
It was, yes. But we did have a very good, he devised a very good punishment for the individuals, which was to do some work for the country park, and what they had to do was to rake out and renovate, as it were, a quickset hedge. which is an extraordinarily, I mean, a blackthorn quickset hedge growing sideways at the bottom and staked through is a very prickly and uncomfortable environment in which to work. And they had a whole day of it, didn't they?
It was an enormous hedge. I have never seen such a long hedge in my life. If you stood on Aldenham Road and looked into the country park, this hedge disappeared over the horizon. And the boys, typical haberdasher, we talk about haberdasher qualities. Haberdashers completely lack judgment. They're very bright, have all these brilliant ideas, but complete lack of judgment. But when they are caught red-handed, they do own up and actually try and make amends. And this was a wonderful example of, I think the central group had about 7 or 8 people in it, our brightest and best as usual, and we worked on this hedge solidly. It was actually more than one day. We had to come back for a second day, and they did a superb job. So I think that's a haberdasher characteristic, to get yourself out of a tricky corner, and they certainly did that.
I also believe they also collected a lot of money for this chicken, and so much so that the director at the country park wanted them to steal one again.
Yes. We won't tell them about the prep school boy who smeared pasta sauce on Tom Taylor's nose in the music department. But anyway, what aspect? What aspects of the job did you enjoy most, or did you feel were particularly suited to your many talents?
Well, I've always loved teaching, though, as I say, I'm not sure it does any good. I enjoyed being in the classroom, particularly with the sixth form. As far as being head of sixth form is concerned, I enjoyed the way that things developed as stories, a sort of sense of narrative that there was with individuals. I suppose what I took much pleasure in giving sixth form assemblies and spent a lot of time researching those and writing them, and whether they're any good or not, my own pupils will have to say, but that was something I did get a lot of pleasure from. And I used as my prompt to think of topics, because it's an oddity of the human mind that it cannot think of something out of nothing. Nothing will come of nothing. You need to be told, if you tell a child to write an essay about anything, he cannot think of anything at all to do. But if you say, write a story involving a 10-pence coin, an Alka-Seltzer, and a skipping rope, he's tumbling over with ideas. My source of ideas was a book I had called The Wordsworth Book of Days, which gave you the date of every day in the year with a number of events connected to it. And in that list of 20 or so, I always found something that would inspire me to create a talk.
Yes, sometimes we were invited to give a sixth form assembly, and of course it was very daunting because Frank had set this enormously high standard. But he also always liked a copy of your talk. So I dutifully handed in my copy after I'd given a particular sixth form assembly, and to my surprise it was returned with corrections in red. I'm pleased that the one that hit the archive didn't have any mistakes in it. Did you have any regrets about your chosen career? Do you think you could have been a footballer or something instead? Or?
I suppose after I'd been a teacher for about 8 years, I received a summons to appear at the Old Bailey as a juror. And I did it twice, actually. Once then in I suppose it was the late 70s, and then again at Wood Green in perhaps the late 80s. And the second time, it was sort of an automated process, and you were given a number and you had to ring in the morning, and they would read out a list of numbers, and you would know whether to report or not. But earlier than that, everybody had to turn up every morning. And I didn't realise this, but when I got to the Old Bailey, I found that there was an enormous surplus of jurors. About 300 or 400 people turned up. far more than they needed, and they were just dismissed. But I mean, I had the day off school, so I would just go and listen to a case, just walk through a door and listen to a case. And it did strike me that if I had not been a teacher, I would have been able to earn a living as an advocate, and I think I might have enjoyed it. And I did, not very seriously, really for financial reasons, but I did think about whether to start over again with my career as a trainee barrister.
One of the joys of being a teacher, and indeed a retired teacher, is of course the opportunity to meet up with current pupils and former pupils. I went in on Friday to pick up the amplification equipment, and I have to say I disagree with Frank. I have never found Haberdashers' boys discourteous. They do say things which are inappropriate, but that's a different matter. That's all about tone and register and so on. I've always found them incredibly pleasant and great fun to be with, and as I say, went in on Friday, and it's I don't miss the school that much, funnily enough. You would think somebody who'd been there for 30 odd years would miss the school. I don't miss it at all, except when you go in there and they say, "Hello sir, great to see you." It really is wonderful. So and also seeing the people I taught coming back today. I mean, it is one of the most delightful experiences. I wonder if you've managed to keep up with some of your former pupils.
Well, I have never sought them out, and I've always felt that if they want to see me, then the initiative lies with them, and because they might find it rather a bore, and they feel that they have to be polite to me and so on, and might not wish to see me, in fact. So, but if they come to me, as it were, I'm always delighted to see them. And you and I both, in fact, have enjoyed recently the company of a group of leavers from, when was it, 1982, I think, who have an informal dinner every now and then down in Hampstead at the Freemasons' Arms. And I've enjoyed their company a lot. And out of that has come a certain amount of private tuition work with their children, but more importantly, my membership of a very interesting group of book readers who have invited me into membership with them, and so I've particularly enjoyed that. But I've always liked to see old boys in a less forbidding environment than a classroom.
Anyway, although retirement has been quite a small proportion of our lives, we've now been enjoying retirement for a few years. But I understand that since you retired, you've had a recent brush with the law.
Yes, and it's had rather a happy outcome. In July this year, the first day or two of July, I was near home. I was walking through an alleyway, which is a shortcut. I suppose it was once a footpath in the open fields, and was built over in Edwardian times. This alleyway is about 50 yards long and about 5 or 6 feet wide. And it was a midsummer's evening this year, and I was walking through there, as I do once or twice a day, and have done for the last 25 years, when three white youths came on bicycles towards me. The first of them waited till he was about as far from me as John is, though we were a bit closer because the alleyway is so narrow, and then shouted, I suppose to startle me, at the top of his voice. He was pedalled on. The second, when he became very, very close to me, about 3 feet, spat in my face. And the third cycled past with an icy glare. Well, I was very startled and rather disgusted, but I did have my wits about me sufficiently to think, well, if the youth is so bold and brazen as to spit in the face of an elderly and harmless stranger, then he's probably got previous. So I resisted the temptation to wipe my face, which is very strong in those circumstances, and got home. I took a cotton bud and took saliva from my face. It was dripping, and I sealed it in a food bag and put it in the fridge. And I thought, if I'm still upset about it tomorrow, I'll take it to the police station and see if they can find out who did this. Well, the following morning I found I wasn't cross about it anymore. I wasn't hurt, and I wasn't particularly interested anymore, but my wife insisted that I should take it to the police station. She said, well, people just simply shouldn't get away with this sort of thing. They just, our fellow human beings just deserve more respect. And even though it's not apparently serious, it is significant. So I took it there to the police station. Their response the following day was to send me a letter saying that no further action is being taken, and said that there was no forensic evidence in connection with my incident. So I picked up the telephone and to tell them that there was forensic evidence, and why didn't they look at it? But in fact, I was told that this is the first initial letter from the crime management unit, who send it to everybody. So I'm glad I hadn't had my arm broken and be told the following day that there was no evidence. But anyway, a couple of days later, somebody did appear with to take a sample from me, and then a good 2 months later, I was contacted to say they had in fact identified this individual, this youth, a Barnet youth as he remains to me, I don't know his name, and the grinding of the law moved slowly on, with the eventual consequence that a Barnet youth on the 27th of September pleaded guilty to a charge of common assault at Willesden Magistrates Court, where I think Bill Crossman once sat on the bench. I was extremely relieved that I didn't have to give evidence, because although the procedure didn't worry me very much, I didn't want much to be seen and recognised by this youth's elders, brothers and uncles and so on. And of course my name, my address would obviously be very, I don't know if my address was actually be given in court if I had to give evidence. Anyway, it was a nice outcome for it. I was particularly anxious not to be cross-examined by a legal representative of the accused, because when the police told me about the report, the forensic report, they said that there were 3 DNA samples that I had produced. One was my own, one was the offending youth, and the third was the DNA of a 44-year-old man living in Warrington. And I didn't really want to be closely questioned by clever counsel who wanted to know why such a gentleman's saliva should be around my lips and cheek. I can only think that because DNA testing has become so sophisticated and so sensitive, that everybody's DNA is everywhere now. On our knives and forks, there will be not only our DNA, but everybody that we've shaken hands with today. And I had travelled a lot. I'd been on the tube, I'd been on the bus, and I had picked up the metro and so on in the bus. And I must have just put my hand, it had been handled by this gentleman from Warrington, and I'd put my hand on my face. And I suppose that was the reason, but I didn't want to give any explanations about this. It was actually the 3rd time I've been involved with a legal case. The first time was in 1967, when I was appeared before Dartford Magistrates Court on the charge of driving a car with a noisy silencer. This was an MG car, rather a nice car, an MG ZB Magnet, if anybody could, pre-Farina, very nice car. But I was then a student at Oxford, but I had a private tuition pupil for O-level who lived some distance away, and I'd borrowed this car to get there, and I was stopped by the police, and because the exhaust pipe completely detached from the exhaust manifold, and it sounded like a Sherman tank, in fact. And I appeared before the magistrates, and I was asked if I had anything to say. And I made a very pretty speech about the high calling of teaching and how I had to get there and couldn't let my pupil down and so forth. Then I think magistrates are not always aware, perhaps because their hearing is fading, how clearly their interjudicial comments are heard. So the chairman turned to the lady on his left and said, £5, do you think? And she said, don't be too hard, he spoke nicely. The chairman then turned to me and said, you are fined £2. And I always use that thereafter as an example to my pupils as of the importance of speaking nicely, articulately, and with good grammar and so forth. I ceased to give that advice about 20 years ago when I realised it was no longer true. And actually it's quite a social advantage not to sound posh. Now George Osborne indeed has training, doesn't he, to change his vowels to a more vernacular style. But the second time I'd been involved in a court case was in 1979 in the firemen's strike, when I apprehended an arsonist. Somebody in the road, somebody had set fire to a garage in the road during a prolonged firemen's strike that we had at that time. And we had to call up green goddesses to put out fires, which never arrived until the fire had gone out. And so it was on this occasion, but he'd also set fire, the arsonist had set fire to the rubbish bin in my garden, and that I hadn't seen the other fire at that time. I went down to the kitchen and I filled the Le Creuset saucepan with water, and then went out into the garden and extinguished the fire in my bin. But there was a passer-by with a dog, and this was about 1 a.m. And he said, if he wants to know the bloke what done it, he's hiding over there. And he pointed to a porch. So I marched up to this porch with my Le Creuset in my hand, and I said, I know you're there, come out. And no movement. Eventually came out rather a sheepish way. And I recognised him as a youth who lived in the street, actually. And he said, I'm going to go now. He said, I'm not stopping. My wife, meanwhile, had rung the police. And he said, I said, you can't. You just have to stay here till the police arrive. He said, you stopping me? And I said, I shall hit you on the head with this saucepan if you try to go. And he stayed. I had very little belief that he would. Anyway, poor chappie went down to Feltham Young Offenders Institute for 6 months. But I did get a letter of commendation from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. And I mentioned some time later at school about this incident in connection with the arrest powers of the individual citizen. And it became school folklore, and I was seen as something of a hero, and for at least 20 years afterwards people said, sir, can you tell us about the citizen's arrest you did, sir? And so that turned out rather well as well.
I think you deserved a guest appearance at the Tory party conference. Anyway, we know that retirement is a noble estate, and I wonder if you'd tell us how you've spent your retirement. You stayed firmly rooted in Finchley, where you've lived for many years. Do you have any wish to travel, to move to a different area? I mean, how do you anticipate spending your retirement, and what have you done so far that's notable?
Not a lot is probably. I mean, I'm an indolent fellow, but I haven't travelled. I think it's probably something to do with that extreme restless period early in my life that has made me desire to stay in the same place. And the London suburbs where I've ended up are probably as good a place as any. But I do a certain amount of teaching still. I do a certain amount of private tuition. I've never sought it, but it has always come to me. Not always children. I've very much enjoyed recently teaching a barrister whose native first language is not English, and who wants to take exams for the judiciary. I've enjoyed teaching her a lot, and I have at present a Habs girl pupil whose English is impeccable, but who has anxious parents, and I'm afraid I have not told them that there is really no need to engage me any longer. So I enjoy that. I do not look forward to it very much, but I enjoy it when I'm there, and afterwards I feel indefinably happier. And I think that's one of the great things about teaching, that it does actually make people, or it always made me, feel happier than I felt before. So I've done that. I suppose the other major activity I've done is an awful lot of reading, and the book club that I belong to has always kept me on my toes about that, kept me in touch with modern literature. So I enjoy that very much.
And do you have any ambitions, aspirations to achieve something that you haven't so far done?
Well, it's an interesting question. You should ask me that. As you get older, you begin to make sort of calculations, mathematical calculations about probability. Now, the other day, I found my stapler had run out, and so I went to ask about getting staples for it. It said Offrex. It said Offrex 5060. So I asked about Offrex 5060, and the man said, they don't make those anymore. But if you bring it in, I'll find the one that fits it. So I took it in, and I bought the Rexel 50, which work. And I took it home. I thought it cost rather a lot for this, and it's £7.99. And I wrote a little card out to stick on the bottom of the stapler, so Rexel 50 also fits. I was about to stick it on when I thought, 5,000 staples in this box. That's why it costs £7.99. What is the probability that I will ever buy staples again? I thought, well, if I use staples 3 times a week, which is certainly not more than that and probably less, then this box of staples will last me till I'm 98. So I didn't put on the label. But, it's very different calculations that people make at the beginning of their lives. Last week in the Telegraph there was a report about induction courses at Cambridge University, and it said Cambridge University first-year students are being given an entitlement of 60 contraceptives a week. I thought about that, and I thought, goodness, if everybody's getting them, boys and girls, that's actually 120 a week. I thought, what sort of calculation is that, 120 a week? That's the sort of the calculations of youth and what is required. It did say enthusiastic students can apply after their limit is used up for contraceptives at a reduced rate, a reduced price. Then I thought of something else that probably I am anxious to try and use up before the end of my life. I'm not, as you know, a computer person at all. I don't have email. So I write letters, and I enjoy receiving letters too. But I thought, but my friend Malcolm, who has something of a siege mentality, when he heard that second-class stamps were going up from 33 pence to 45 earlier this year, he bought 1,800. And he gave me 900 of them.
He doesn't believe in first-class stamps. I've got 900 second-class stamps now, and it would be my aspiration to use those up before I die.
I look forward to receiving my Christmas card. Anyway, finally, not perhaps surprising for an English teacher, you have a great love of poetry. Would you finish with telling us about a favourite poem?
Yes, perhaps I should stand up to do this because I think he deserves it. It's very much an Ulster poem, so I'll attempt an Ulster accent to say it. It's called The Ballad of William Bloat. In a mean abode on the Shankill Road loved a man named William Bloat. He had a wife, the bane of his life, who continually got his goat. So one day at dawn, when she'd her nightdress on, he cut her bloody throat. With a razor gash he settled her hash, oh never was crime so quick, but the drip, drip, drip on the pillow slip of her lifeblood made him sick, and the pool of gore on the bedroom floor grew clotted, cold and thick. And yet he was glad he had done what he had, as she lay there stiff and still. But a sudden awe of the angry law struck his heart with an icy chill. So to finish the fun so well begun, he resolved himself to kill. He took off the sheet from his wife's cold feet and twisted it onto a rope, and he hanged himself from the pantry shelf. 'Twas an easy end, let's hope. In the face of death, with his latest breath, he solemnly cursed the Pope. Yet the strangest turn of the whole concern was only just beginning. He went to hell, but his wife got well, and she's still alive and sinning. For the razor blaze was Dublin made, but the sheet was Belfast linen.
Do you fancy fielding any questions, or should we leave it there?
Probably nearly 4, I think probably stop.
Yeah. Okay, well, all that remains is for me to thank Frank very much for allowing a sort of this is your life experiment in the clubhouse. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I have had the great pleasure and enjoyment of spending various days out with Frank. We actually, in our retirement, choose a destination and then set off for the day and visit various places of interest. And it's as you can imagine, he is very entertaining company. Always got interesting.
Can I just stop you there a moment, John? Just say one other thing, because why I agreed to do this. I had always held with Dennis Thatcher that it was, who never gave an interview, that it was better to keep your mouth shut and be thought an idiot than to open it and prove you, than to open it and prove it. So I always turned down requests for interviews from school magazine and so on. And when I left Habs, I left with David Griffith, physics, and David Lindsay, as very long-serving members of staff. And I was asked to give an interview to the school magazine, and I declined. But this is a good example of the way that Haberdasher boys get their own back, because they published the 2 interviews with my colleagues under the title Two Wise Men, with the understood subtext, and one blithering idiot who's too stuck up to answer questions. I thought it was very haberdashers.
Anyway, I'm sure you wish to join with me in thanking Frank for his